So I think we'll start. We spent 2 sessions were devoted to the 3 sections of the Musaf service of Rosh Hashanah, Malkhuyot, Zikhronot and Shofarot, which are very, very interesting and at the same time present some challenges for us moderns. As we approach those prayers, we encounter a literalism that is not always satisfying or meaningful or easy to embrace. And then Felicia, his session last week, she presented on Tokef, also a text that has its complexities and not easy to embrace in its literal form. And tonight we're going to go into looking at Kol Nidrei, and then perhaps as well as the 13 attributes of God, which are repeated through the day of Yom Kippur several times. So we're going to begin with Kol Nidrei. Kol Nidrei, of course, is the opening prayer of the most sacred day of the year. We prepare intensely. In fact, Rosh Hashanah is in some way also a preparation, and the 10 days of repentance, a preparation for Yom Kippur and for Kol Nidrei. And we come to the synagogue with very, very deep emotion, I think with deep desire to engage in the spiritual work of the day. And as soon as we come in, and people come in on time, it's the only service in the year that people come really, everybody's there on time. And we start with a full congregation, no matter whether the congregation is big or small, wherever we are, it's everybody that needs to be there is usually there. And immediately as we begin, the ark is opened, and the Sifrei Torah are taken out of the ark, and we begin to hear this melody, whether with instruments or sung by the cantor, and many of us just feel a very, very deep emotion, and many of us are in tears. For many of us, it evokes many things. We see ourselves with those of us who've made a Jewish journey for many years. We see ourselves with loved ones, with grandparents, with I don't know. Just it brings up, at least for me, a lot of very, very profound and dear memories. And then the music and the chant and the melody of the Kol Nidrei it touches something in all of us. I think in many of us, if not in all of us, some deep fiber in our being. And then you look at the text of Kol Nidrei, and number one, it's not a prayer, and it's a legal formula. And so there is some very big gap, between how we feel and the text that is in front of us. I'm going to share it in the screen so everybody can see. Actually, I don't have it from Mahzor Lev Shalem, but I have it from Sefaria. So the translation is a little different than what we used to, but it has an introduction. In the introduction it says that with the consent of God, Aldat HaMakom, HaMakom is God's name, Aldat HaKahal, and the consent of this congregation, Bishiva Shel Malo, Bishiva Shel Mata, in a convocation of the heavenly court, up in the heavens, in the convocation of the lower court, and that's us. We constitute ourselves as a court of peers in some way. We hereby grant permission to pray with transgressors. We're all transgressors, and we give ourselves permission to establish a court and to go through this ritual and to recite this formula called Kol Nidrei, even though we are not all worthy of sitting in a court. A court is usually, people are dignified and respectful and honorable people, and at this particular moment we feel we're not worthy, but we give ourselves permission to pray amongst a community of transgressors and to constitute ourselves in a court. Just a quick word that Kol Nidrei begins early, before sunset, has to be recited and completed before sunset, because a court only sat during the day and not in the evening. And so that's the reason why, because we are sort of enacting a court, and courts would only sit during the day. That's why Kol Nidrei is recited, and it's recited 3 times in order to make sure that everybody can hear it, even people who are sometimes a little late. So now to the text.
I would just add also that that's another reason why we wear talit. We can wear the talit in night is because we put it on. The purpose of wearing the talit is to see the tzitzit, and at night, presumptually, you don't see the tzitzit, but because we're putting the talit on before sundown on this earlier time, that's one of the reasons why it's allowed and expected on Kol Nidrei.
Thank you. So I will read the translation. I have here Mahzor Lev Shalem, so I will read the translation from Lev Shalem, okay? And it says like this: Kol Nidrei means all vows, renunciations, bans, oaths, formulas of obligation, pledges and promises. These are all different categories of commitments that were made in biblical times. There were things called vows, and there were things called prohibitions that people took upon themselves, bans. And for example, people vowed for example, a certain animal for the temple dedicated to God. People take upon themselves prohibitions, saying, for example, the Nazir, the what is it called, the
Nazarite.
It would take upon him or herself the prohibition to drink wine, for example. So people would make all sorts of commitments and sometimes prohibitions on themselves, or would dedicate things to the temple. So these are all sorts of different categories of different obligations, some nuances between all these things. Renunciation, vows, renunciations, bans, oaths, formulas of obligation, pledges, promises. The text goes on, that we vow or promise to ourselves and to God from this Yom Kippur to the next. May it approach us for good. We hereby retract. May they all be undone, repealed, cancelled, voided, annulled, and regarded as neither valid nor binding. You see how many synonyms there are here, covering every single possible angle. All types of commitments are contained in here. All types of verbal commitments, written commitments, everything that a person may have vowed or banned or taken as a commitment is contemplated here. And then you can see it says undone, repealed, cancelled, voided, annulled, and regarded as neither valid nor binding. Our vows shall not be considered vows, our renunciations shall not be considered renunciations, and our promises shall not be considered promises. That's Kol Nidrei. So, I began by saying that this is a very emotional moment, and you look at the text, and it's a purely legal formula that has no, it's not a prayer. It's just a renunciation and a rejection of all commitments. Just a couple of words about the history of this text. As I said, in biblical times and on, people used to take upon themselves all sorts of commitments, sacred obligations to the temple and so on. There is a whole section in the Talmud that deals with nedarim, with these type of vows, and it's very, very intricate and very complicated. And at some point, people started wanting to annul the commitments that they had taken upon themselves, vows and promises and oaths. And so they came up with this formula. The rabbis did not like it. They thought it was somewhat dishonorable for people to undo their commitments this way. And the first time, according to the scholars, that there is a rejection by the rabbis of this specific text called Nidre with some minor modifications is sometime in the middle of the 8th century in Babylonia. And it is indicated in that rejection by the rabbis of Babylonia that the text came from the land of Israel. So scholars know that this text emerged around the 8th century in the land of Israel. Eventually, even with all the opposition of the rabbis, the people's will was prevailed, and this became a part of the liturgy, the opening liturgy of Yom Kippur, even against the rabbis' opposition. And not everywhere, there were many places where this was not accepted, even in medieval times. Around the 12th century, Rashi's son-in-law, Rabbi Meir ben Shmuel, changed a line that appeared here, because it used to say, and the things that we have vowed and sworn and dedicated from last Yom Kippur until this Yom Kippur, it was retroactive. In other words, all the things that we did not commit, that we committed to, but we did not fulfill in the year that ends, we declare them annulled. But he made it projecting into the future, from now until next year. Everything that we commit ourselves to will be a priori voided. So if I make a commitment now, it's voided because I have declared this formula in advance. So it's a priori. Just one more word. So this is the text that appears in most Ashkenazic congregations. It's from this year to next year. Sephardic congregations still maintain the original text from last year to now. Some have both, just to cover all bases. And the last thing I'll say before passing it to Felicia, sort of as this historical review, is that the melody that is sang in Ashkenazic congregations and repeated 3 times is not from biblical times. Moses did not come down. You know, Moses came down from the mountain, having sought and obtained forgiveness from God for the betrayal of the golden calf. He came down on Yom Kippur, bringing forgiveness to the people. And he did not come down singing Kol Nidre in the melody that we know. It was not in the Talmud. It's a melody that, according to musicologists, somewhere in the 17th century maybe, they started singing this, and maybe it's the melody or close to the melody we have now. It eventually became established maybe 200-300 years ago, and which is not a short time. And this is the melody that prevails in Ashkenazic congregations. Sephardic congregations have a different chant, and in some communities it's repeated not 3 times but 7 times. So there are a lot of variations in terms of how this this formula is recited, always preceding the beginning of the service of Yom Kippur. And I'll pass it now to Felicia. Should I keep the... I'll take it down, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
I would just say just some other historical notes that there is some belief that the idea of Kol Nidrei, although it's distinctly different, that there was a notion of in Mesopotamia, they had magic bowls with these nullification formulas written on them, and that was in some way understood to have some relationship to Kol Nidrei, that the bowls were kind of magical forces to hold back the demons in terms of the annulment of vows that would come kind of external forces. Now, Kol Nidrei is obviously, there are some similarities that are understood, but also significant differences from that, because obviously Kol Nidrei doesn't address demonic powers, external powers. It's really about us and God, and it's also an oral ritual rather than something that's in a bowl. But there's some historical evidence that there's a relationship between the two. So just to note that. I think so I mean, in terms of what's challenging about the text of Kol Nidrei, obviously, is even the notion of annulment of anticipated vows at all, that we would essentially function on the principle that what we say doesn't matter. There's a moral impurity about that orientation, either retroactively towards the past, which is where the original prayer begins, or a priori, as Roly spoke about, to the future. What kind of person essentially functions saying my commitments don't matter, what I promise to do is obsolete, and particularly at a time of year when we're trying to aspire to become a new human being and to recognize all the ways we failed. It's somewhat of a morally incomprehensible action to say that it doesn't matter. And so in many ways, that's at the crux of the challenge, which was also not only part of the rabbi's concern, because the rabbis took vows and promises so seriously. People weren't supposed to enter into those kind of agreements or commitments with levity in any way. The tradition puts huge emphasis on not making vows that you can't keep. And so it essentially diminishes the power of commitments that people make. In addition, of course, as in times when Jews were living in mixed spaces, the feeling was also that if have an exercise to annul our commitments, then of course, outsiders, Christians would then, or not, we were the outsiders in a certain way, the dominant culture would then say, well, those Jews don't keep their commitments. And then there are actually historic records of people Jews having to go through an exercise, a kind of legal exercise in the context of the Christian culture to affirm that they were going to follow through on their commitments, because of the idea that we had a formula that would disavow our commitments. So it was not only a problematic, it's not only problematic in the sense of what it means to be a human being and make commitments either to God or to one another, but in addition also caused somewhat of a concern in the culture at large.
I want to add that many Jews were embarrassed by this, by the Kol Nidrei. In many Mahzorim in the 19th century, in Reform Mahzorim, the Kol Nidrei was eliminated. It was not recited because Jews were embarrassed about this notion that, and particularly vis-a-vis non-Jews and Gentiles in the places where they lived, that a Jew's word cannot be taken seriously. The Jews themselves, as Felicia said, the Jews themselves are annulling their commitments, and so they eliminated this from the Mahzor. It was, of course, later on made it back into the Reform prayer book for the High Holidays, but there was a period of time when this was not the case.
And there's if you're interested in more of the historical development, there were attempts to change it. There were, they would include pieces and not include others, particularly in the Reform movement, what they took out and what they kept in. But ultimately, the will of the people prevailed. There was something about this non-prayer formula that became so incredibly powerful that it, in a sense, won beyond its actual literal meaning, which, again, as Roly spoke about, is not spiritual, right? It's legal. It's not a prayer, and its own fiber is questionable in terms of its morality. And so we're left with these words at this most auspicious time of year, and probably the most powerful moments of the year, when we all gather. And as I too have plenty of memories of that moment and the awesomeness of, and both the sense of memories, but also the sense of fear and kind of anticipation of the importance of the day, which is conveyed both in the music, which is so evocative for so many of us, but also in the sense that this is the beginning of this pilgrimage that we take throughout the 25 hours of Yom Kippur. And yet what we're saying actually feels somewhat obscure, unimportant, not in line with the moment. So what do you do with that, Roly? What do you?
I just wanted to point out that in many ways, the tension between declaring that our words, our commitments are worthless, that we are unable to keep our commitments, that our words are basically cheap and worthless, and then we begin an entire day when there are many, many, many words, holy words that we say, and the entire day, and the most important day, we're not silent. We're speaking lots of words. We're reciting lots of words. So I see a tension, between, because we really do mean the words that hopefully we recite in the course of the next 25 hours, until Neilah. So that's something interesting to think about. What do I do?
I would also add, I think one of the things that's also powerful or recognizes the power of words, and in many ways also the question about the commitments we make to God, to to ourselves, etc., in kind of the declaring of what we are attempting to commit to, is that often we make commitments and vows without recognizing the actual implications of what is going to be required. In a moment, we might say, I dedicate this to so-and-so, or I'm going to commit to this. And this is true also of many things we do, not all that fall in the realm of vows and all the other lists of things that are in Kol Nidre, but we have no actual idea of how we're going to follow through, right? We put an intention out there. It's not even that from a spiritual or emotional place that the commitments we make are false commitments. We make commitments with the understanding that we think we're going to follow through, unless we're lying, which I think most of us are not intending to do. But that the truth is, as life progresses, we don't know always what those dedications will truly mean. And I think there's a recognition of the fallibility of the commitments we make without recognizing the totality of what it's going to ask of us, which is part of the challenge.
So you asked, what do I do with it? The truth is that I inhabit this moment very, very deeply. And the ritual is just awesome. In the truth, it's awesome. It's awesome. The presence of the congregation, everybody feeling the sense of awe and I guess trembling in their heart. I feel the presence of the generations. I feel the true awe of the moment. the ritual with all the Torot out. I mean, it's not just one Torah, it's not two, it's all the Sifrei Torah are out. We're standing facing each other. And I just feel very deeply this moment. The music touches me, particularly the moment, the Kedushat Hayom, the sense of holiness in this moment. And so I have to say it's the power of the ritual, to begin with. I mean, and we've anticipated this moment. We've been preparing. We've been imagining it. We've been anticipating. We've been waiting, and then the day itself. The day of Yom Kippur itself. Sometimes we've asked forgiveness from people. Before we get to Kol Nidre, people that we believe we've hurt, and then we get ready for this day. We're dressed in white. We have eaten our final meal, before an entire day of fasting. I mean, there's a lot that goes into this moment, a lot of preparation, a lot of anticipation. Then we get there, and it has its power. The ritual and the moment have their power. And then I personally take hold of these words, or sort of dwell in these words, and I feel a profound sense of shame, an embarrassment about my not having come through, for in all sorts of commitments, promises that I've made to myself, to God, to other people. I look back at last Yom Kippur and I, planned or intended to, or wished, committed to, whatever word you want to use, to be better, to do this, to do that. And then you look at the record and, and so I feel profoundly embarrassed, disappointed. I know that I've let people down. I let God down. I let myself down. I let my family down. I let my friends down, So it's a, it's a moment to feel, and Heschel has a whole beautiful, short but beautiful essay about the role of embarrassment in Yom Kippur, which I take very seriously. I think it's a very, very helpful emotion. Not always. It's not always good to be embarrassed. But on this night, on this day, I think it is good to feel embarrassment and shame. And that's what that's where I am. And then when we finish this and we say the next words, I'm going to put them in the screen.
Wait, let's wait. Yeah, I just want to, I just want to point out a couple of other things before we get to the next words about the piece about embarrassment and shame. In some way, we declare that because we constitute the community of sinners before we even say Kol Nidre. I think that's not it's not an accident in a sense, which is to constitute a community of folks who have strayed. I mean, and there's a certain amount of already acknowledgement about our failures, and that the kahal that we're with is a fallible kahal. It's a kahal that and I think actually we've spoken about this over the years, because we often are jumping from service to service with a different kahal, from the evening to the morning to the afternoon, and how actually traveling with the same kahal is its own journey, right? Because by being amongst all of us who have failed and have shame and embarrassment, that is evocative of a different scaffolding to move through prayer, rather than alternatively, sometimes we grew up in scenarios where the external was more important than the internal. There's too much emphasis on the packaging of what you're going to wear for the holidays, or the procession of external elements. And by focusing on the nature of who we are as a kahal of transgressors, which has its origins in the fact that you had to declare a fast day with the sinners. But nonetheless, I think that confrontation with this is who I am, and I'm not actually looking to see who the other sinner is, but it's me, is deeply powerful. And the other thing I think that is also really powerful, amongst many others, is the notion of the joining together of the heavenly court and the earthly court. That in this moment, there is a sense of liminality between heaven and earth. And in fact, I think throughout the process of Yom Kippur, we are trying to move our earthly selves to a more angelic state. In many ways, we embody the angelic function, because we don't need human, or we don't live with humanly elements during Yom Kippur, not food, not sex, all the things that make certain aspects of us that make us human and in some way beastly, that are disappeared. And the moment of Kol Nidre, in a sense, stitches together heaven and earth to make us live in that kind of space, which is an in-between, which is the embodiment of what it means to be a human, which is both divine and earthly, and to try to push ourselves to embodying a more divine commitment, which is in some way another piece of Kol Nidre, which is the letting go of all the things that we hold on to allow ourselves to transcend the script that's been written, or the script that we think will be limited to moving forward.
So I just want to put on the screen the next, the text that we recite right after Kol Nidre. Kol Nidre is here, and then we say this: "V'nislach lechol adat ben Israel v'lager agar betocham ki lechol ha'am bishgaga." Forgive the entire congregation. Actually, v'nislach means, and the whole congregation was forgiven. How they translate here: the entire congregation of the people of Israel shall be forgiven, as well as the stranger who dwells among them, for all have erred. So this is a quote from the Torah, and then the next thing, Slach lana avon hazeh, please pardon. I will read it in the translation here. Moshe prayed, as befits your abundant love, please forgive this people's sin, just as you have always forgiven these people from the time of the Exodus from Egypt until now. And this is from after the sin of the spies. Okay, when the people say, we don't want to go to the land of Israel, we don't want to go to the promised land, we want to go back to Egypt, and God becomes furious with them and wants to destroy them, and Moshe intercedes for them. And then this is what Moshe says: please forgive these people's sin, because they are they're people, they're human. And then it says, Vayomer Adonai, the response, Salachti kidvarecha, a quote from the Torah as well. Vayomer Adonai salachti kidvarecha, Adonai replied to Moshe's request, I have forgiven as you have asked. So that's the dialogue that happens here, and with all quotes from the Torah that create then a sense of the fact that our annulment of our commitments and our vows and our oaths and so on has actually been accepted, and there is a great sense of release at this moment. It's forgiven. I don't have to carry this burden anymore. And then it's not here in Sefaria, but in the Mahzor and in all the Mahzorim, comes Shecheyanu. We say Shecheyanu, we've come to this moment, to this great moment when there is this joy. We've been carrying this tension, this shame, this embarrassment, all this burden, of all the unfulfilled commitments and words. And then we quote these verses from the Torah, which actually release us, forgive us, release us, and remove that burden. And it's like everything lifts. Of course, then we go into Yom Kippur to deal with more stuff. But at least in this moment, there is a partial moment of great release, and I think we feel it. You know, you can feel it in the community, and when the moment of Shechianu happens, it's just, again, it's an awesome moment. Rabbi Soloveitchik says that this Shechianu is the highest Shechianu of all the Shechianos that we recite, all the holidays, and every time that we have an opportunity to say Shechianu, this one is the most consequential, joyous, deepest one of all. And it's a very, very powerful moment when we wrapped in some nigun or something, you know, I think to contain all the joy and all the sense of relief that we have.
And also, I think to express the release, I think the nigun does that as well. We didn't used to do that many years ago. That was something we added over the years, because I think on the one hand, Yom Kippur is seen with such solemnity and seriousness, and obviously pageantry, etc. But there's a deep hope that lives in Yom Kippur. And in many ways, the Shechianu is one step along that hope train, right? Which allows us to say, I'm not going to be bound to everything forever. Like, there is actually a turning point. And I think Yom Kippur is a progression of turning points over the course of the 25, 26 hours, helping us to say we can release from all these burdens we carried. There's some ritualistic release, which I think happens with Kol Nidre and Shechianu, and then it's followed by all our work release, all our prayers, etc. And we, many years ago, heard this teaching of Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shalomi, which I think has continued to inform our own understanding of Kol Nidre, which was to essentially say, I'm not attached anymore to, I can choose again, which is not an orientation that we tend to hold. You know, we're always tied to something, and this moment of release is the recognition that we have the opportunity to choose again, and that also is embodied with the biblical, you know, that the quotes from the book of Bamidbar after the sin of the spies, to say that you're not going to carry this with you forever. This is a moment in time where God is going to forgive. And so I think there's something deeply powerful about that moment.
Maybe we'll take a couple of questions if people have, or comments. Please, if you'd like to participate in this way, making a short comment or asking a question, please go to reactions in the bottom right towards the right of the screen, and find the little yellow hand to raise.
Hannah,
yeah.
I just wanted to comment on the whole question of the past tense versus future tense of Kol Nidre, because personally, the change from past tense to future tense, for me, it makes the whole paragraph totally illogical. Like, it no longer makes any sense to me. What makes perfect sense to me is to say, you know, last year we made vows. We feel bad because we didn't fulfill them. We would like to be released from the burden of our disappointment so that next year we can do better. You know, that to me makes perfect sense. But as soon as you flip it to the future, oh, the vows we haven't yet made, we're already annulling. You know, I'm sorry, I can't make head or tails of that. So for me, I mean, frankly, I agree with you about the solemnity of the occasion. And I also agree that that is mostly from the ritual, not from the text, because the text to me no longer has meaning the way with the change in the tense of the verb.
Well, if I may comment on that, the text that was changed to the future, from now until the future, that was changed by Rashi's son-in-law in the 12th century, actually is much more severe, right? Because it says, nothing that I will say, no commitment that I will make has any validity, any power, even if I make it next month, in 2 months, in 3 months. Just from now, I know that it has no meaning. It's a much more severe approach to our humanity, to our failures. The other one says, okay, look, I made some commitments, some I fulfilled, some I didn't fulfill. Those I didn't fulfill, let them be considered null from last year. But this one is saying nothing that I will say has any validity. I cannot be taken seriously. It's much more severe. So I agree with you. I mean, in the sense that, I mean, I don't agree that it doesn't have any meaning. I agree with you that it's a very harsh view of human beings. Very, very harsh. And you know, and to say we actually have absolutely no word. We never can keep our word. So, but I think it's a moment, you know, Yom Kippur, Kol Nidre, is a moment to see ourselves in a harsh light, not to give ourselves, not now, you know, not to give ourselves an easy way out, to hold ourselves accountable, responsible, to see ourselves, you know, in all humility, in a severe light.
I would also say the majority of people, rabbis, no one actually fully comprehended the meaning of Kol Nidre. I mean, it was so many times attempted to do away with the formula because of all the problematics of that were contained in it, that it's also not a prayer, it's in a service. I mean, as Roly described at the beginning, but no matter what the will of the rabbis of each and every generation, and Lois Dubin put this in the comments, that it wasn't only the Reform movement's disdain for Kol Nidre, also there were Orthodox synagogues as well, rabbis who also didn't feel it was a worthwhile prayer to have because of its complications. And so in many ways, the concerns we have been throughout the course of the history of Kol Nidre sustained, and yet it still it triumphed over all the concerns. And that's in many ways one of the powers of the fact that it's still included, is that despite all the rational objections to its inclusion, the people, Amcha, the general population, consistently overruled the rulings of the rabbis and maintained that it was included, which is kind of a principle of minhag over law, you know, that custom prevailed over law. So in many ways, in that sense, it's a very fascinating kind of example of when the people wanted it because it worked for some reason, it sustained its power. And in many ways, I think we experience that until today.
I just want to just note that there is a little bit of a magical thing here. I mean, you know, it's not entirely devoid of some sort of a magical aspect, you know, reciting an incantation, a formula that will take away this thing, you know, and release our burden. I mean, we're trying to make it, you know, meaningful, significant, rationally understandable, and so on. But there is a side. But there is a side to all of us, you know, that there is an inclination in all of us, you know, for an attraction to something that is magical thinking and magical wishes and stuff like that. So I don't think we should completely deny it. It's present in our tradition, you know, in many ways, in many places, and I don't think we should completely deny or suppress that aspect of ourselves.
I would just add, I think that even in many ways, the power of ritual is its own cleansing experience, right? Even if it's not a rational, intellectualized, everything doesn't make sense that we stay from a literal perspective, but the actual ritual itself does have an impact, or else we wouldn't act it out, and also it wouldn't have prevailed again in Kol Nidre. The fact it clearly worked for people's experience of the power of what Kol Nidre was meant to do in Yom Kippur too.
Jenny.
Yes, I'd like to know more about why it's in the service. Was it a response to forced conversion? I mean, was it asking God to? I thought I had heard that once.
Yeah, there is a common there's a common myth that this was a prayer that was either issued from or was favored by Jews who had converted to Christianity, you know, forcefully being converted in Spain, and that they had made a commitment to Christianity, and they would recite this in order to make their commitment void. It's a myth. It may be that some people recited, you know, took hold of Kol Nidre in order to release themselves from, you know, from that commitment. They had to live outwardly in the street. They had to live as Christians. Otherwise, they could pay with their lives. But internally, they wanted to remain Jewish, and it's possible that some may have recited it, but that's not where it originated. And
people say that also because to play when it says Avar Yanim, to be able to pray with the sinners, they read it as the Iberian, you know, that they read the sinners in for that population, but it's a myth.
So why is it in the service?
Why is it in the service, in our service?
Yes.
So we explained in the beginning that this is something that arose in the 8th century. It was placed on Yom Kippur at the beginning, and the service of Yom Kippur, against the rabbi's wishes, and the people demanded it. Some rabbis accepted it in the land of Israel, and then it became, it spread, and obviously, as Felicia was saying, you know, people really wanted it, and they got it.
Yeah, I don't quite understand why it was put there, though, in the 8th century. I mean, what was the purpose of, you know?
Because the Yom Kippur is a day of atonement. We're asking for forgiveness. Mm-hmm. You know, we want to release ourselves and unburden ourselves from those things for which we feel guilty, you know, for which we feel we have transgressed. Actually, taking on a commitment, making a vow, or making an oath and not fulfilling it is a very big transgression. It was a huge transgression. In biblical times, if you made a vow and you didn't fulfill the vow, you made an oath, you didn't fulfill the oath, you fear that you could be stricken by God, you know, with death. I mean, it was a very, very serious offense. And the mechanism to free yourself from a vow or an oath was a very, very intricate, complicated mechanism, legal mechanism. And so people who didn't fulfill oaths or vows or promises or commitments or, you know, any of these things that are listed here felt very, very burdened. And, you know, before you start the day of Yom Kippur, Day of Atonement, and asking for forgiveness, you certainly want to make sure that those things you're not carrying anymore.
Bob or Amy? I'm assuming it's Mom.
I-
That was what I assumed last time, and I'm assuming it again.
Well, thank you. I want to try to remove the burden of the problem that you both raised this way, thinking of myself and not of anybody else right now. I see the obligation to do the right thing is not in any way blocked by removing the validity of a promise to do the right thing in the future. I see this as clearing a path for making one decision at a time and not negotiating with myself about, well, maybe this time I can cut the corner. I think once you disavow all vows and say they don't mean anything, you are left entirely with the obligation to do the right thing each time with no vow attached to it. It's much easier to see yourself as responsible for doing the right thing, not to meet a vow, but because no vows matter, but the right thing still matters. So I don't see this as a problem. I see this as a strategy for getting each of us to focus on that burden, which is not to make the right vow or meet the vow, but just at the moment, do the right thing.
Beautiful. I mean, I think in many ways, Reb Zalman's orientation towards this is to release of all the negotiation that we have in our mind and in our hearts, and the tie, in many ways we're tied both to the future and the past in such profound ways that entangle us in ways that we're never free to choose again. And I think that's part of what he articulates. He used to teach, Alav Shalom, in releasing us of that burden, because it's so cumbersome to actually live so anchored into stories that we've already told or committed to, or even that we had thought we would tell for the future. Sonia?
I love what Bob just said, and you as well, Felicia. I'm thinking of the Kol Nidre, this aspect of it that's asking to be forgiven for the vows that we're making that we're not going to be able to keep, or that we won't keep, and to even be permitted, in a sense, to sin. I find it, someone pointed this out, it's illogical given the whole meaning and the rest of the content of the service. It's absurd in a sense. And to my mind, it does feel superstitious. It feels like a counterbalance to the profound weight of what we're entering into. Really, you spoke about that, this contrast between taking it all away in advance and then going into it really seriously, like we really, and in the olden days, to be, to be respectful of where this is coming from. It does seem that it needed almost to be there to release in advance the pressure of what was to unfold during the day. I find it remarkable. It's absolutely fascinating, and it seems absurd, but it seems almost, I can understand why it's necessary, given the emotional heaviness and the spiritual heaviness.
Maybe this is some sort of a way to counter some of our arrogance. When we say, I commit to this, I promise this, Felicia said in the beginning, we don't even know where we will be when we have to come out through with that commitment, in a month, in 2 months, in 6 months, I don't know. So, we have a certain arrogance to say, I promise, I commit, I make an oath, and to say, maybe I will do my best. I will try my best. I don't know that I will be able to, but I will try my best. So maybe it sort of counters our sense of absolute certainty, you know, that we sometimes have. Now, if you want to get a loan from somebody, you have to make a commitment that you're going to pay it back. You can't say, well, I'm not so sure, but I'm going to try to do my best, you know. So sometimes you have to make firm commitments to people, right? In many situations in life, but at other times, you know, it's sometimes we act with too much of a sense of certainty, and maybe this is some way to bring us a little bit away from that.
I just want to say that I mean, this doesn't anything that's legal. This doesn't disavow, right? Like, this is not kol nidre. If you had a contract, it doesn't. In the legal realm, this would not hold. It just because you listen to kol nidre on Erev Yom Kippur doesn't apply in a legal scenario or certain commitments as Roly expressed. So I just want to be clear, you know, that this is not living in all realms of existence, and in many ways this is probably what's confusing, or even in some way the tradition recognized over time. Its import is it's not understood, right? Like, everyone's trying to struggle with the true meaning of it, when in many ways over the history the meaning has been disavowed. Sorry.
Nancy and Michael.
I wanted to say that I have always associated kol nidre with the first commandment and the breaking of the first commandment, which is about the future. Well, who knows the future? Only God knows the future. So if you're going to say you know the future, you're making yourself an idol. I'm going to do this. I will meet you X time in a month. Well, who knows? Who knows if that, you know, is going to happen? It's it helps me personally with language. I say, my plan today is to meet you X time in a month, and it's written here on the calendar. But I try very, very hard not to make any promises about the future, because it's not my territory.
Thank you, Nancy. Tony.
Okay, I was just wondering if it couldn't be also much simpler in many ways. Like you were talking about, you've come out of the year and you've been embarrassed and humiliated and disappointed, as so many of us are. Doesn't that make you not want to go into the next year making vows that you know you'll probably be embarrassed and humiliated? And so by having a disclaimer, it makes you more willing to take a risk, just on a very small level, without, just as a person. Like, I know that if I'm busy promising things and I can't keep the promise, I'm not going to make a promise again so fast. You know, I'm not going to risk that. I'm just going to not do any of it. I'm going swimming, getting away from this God who I have to keep following my promises. So couldn't that have something to do with the future? Help people take the risk of making a vow, take the risk of making a promise? That was just a thought.
You mean that if you annul it in advance, nobody's going to take the risk? I'm not following.
I'm sorry, I'm not explaining it well. No, I was just thinking that if you've made a promise or you've done something, and the result of your having done that, in this case made vows, is shame and embarrassment at the other end, you're not as likely to do that same thing again. But by having a disclaimer in the beginning of it, you might take the risk of trying again. That's all I was thinking. And that's a very simple level.
In the sense that you may be more careful next time to try to come true, to try to be true to your word. Is that what you mean? You're gonna.
No, I mean that you might decide not to make any vows, period.
I see. You don't want to take the risk.
Yeah, I don't want to, I know I'm going to fail, so why would I make the vow? However, if I have a disclaimer, then I'll give it a shot. Then I'll try.
Uh-huh.
That's what I was thinking, really on a very, very simple
You're
level.
covered, in other words. You may not want to take the risk if you know that, you know, there's a consequence to your not fulfilling your commitment. But if you're covered in advance, then you might want to take the risk because you know that if you fail, you've been forgiven already, or that you've declared it.
Very, very simple level.
Yeah, a lot of yeah.
I mean, that's all I was thinking. Keep it simple.
Jane. Can you unmute, Jane?
Sorry. I was wondering how much of the Kol Nidre is about promises that we make to God. I'm going to live in the presence, in the awareness of God at all times. And we don't. And to what extent we are begging for forgiveness of vows that we make that nobody can keep, but we make a promise to God that God is going to be in our life at every single moment. We're going to be aware at every single moment. And we always find ourselves, instead of being in the presence all the time, running back and forth.
Beautiful. I mean, I think, you know, that in many ways, for hundreds of years, people have been trying to figure this out, like why, right? And clearly, if there was a one answer to why, that book would have already been written, but it's not. In some way, the mystery of the sustaining of this particular legal formula that in some way is the jumping off point of Yom Kippur, allows us in its expansiveness, which is, our tradition is magical in that way, to actually try to ask the question, who should I be at this moment, right? Which is in many ways the most profound thing to enter Yom Kippur, is to be able to ask that question. And I think in some way, the magic of the moment of that blurring of the lines between heaven and earth, of being both deeply ashamed and embarrassed, and also being able to dream again, is in some ways some of the irony and some of the incredible exquisiteness of the moment, is that we're both, you know, we're both failing human beings, and we're also divine human beings. And the process of moving through the day is to recapture who we're meant to be in that sense, and who God wants us to be. And so, you know, there are books with multiple, Larry Hoffman has a beautiful book in My People's Prayer Book about different meanings besides the history and the music and all the kind of technical development of Kol Nidre, but of also the desire for meaning to come from this strange formula that could have developed out of Mesopotamia because of magic bowls, that has made its way into our liturgy in some form that we're still asking the question, what does it mean? You know, no different now than it was in the 19th century or in the 9th century. And so I think there's something even powerful about that in the mystery of it sustaining itself at this, in some way, the most crucial moment of the year.
I would just add a couple of thoughts to that, and I think it is a moment of stripping ourselves of all pretension. You know, it's who am I at this moment? Truly, honestly, who am I? And to inhabit our humanity, to inhabit our frailty, to inhabit the fact that we make mistakes, that we transgress, that we sin, to inhabit that part of our humanity, we later, will imagine ourselves in a more divine way, later throughout the day. We can imagine ourselves as accomplishing great things, as having great aspirations, as trying to, in some way to stretch towards heaven. But we begin, I believe, in this lower place, and from there we grow. It's important, I think, to begin the day of Yom Kippur in a place of very, very deep humility and very deep honesty, about who we are, and I think this moment gives us that opportunity, to set us at the beginning of Yom Kippur in that very place, and from there, the journey begins, and the journey begins for an entire glorious, magnificent day. And when we end in Neilah, we see the possibility and the opportunity. We see, I think, a little bit more of the divine in ourselves and what we are capable of, because we can grow in our aspiration, in our desire to overcome our, Felicia used the beastly side of ourselves, the animal side of ourselves. And at some point we feel like angels on Yom Kippur. It's really an incredible thing that happens, and I think that's the journey. But the journey begins with Kol Nidrei, with all the awe, with all the fear, with all the humanity, and the lowliness, and loneliness. So, what a glorious day.
Last comment, Harry?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm sort of curious about the phrasing, the concept behind all transgressions, etc. If we're breaking all vows, are we simply walking away from them, putting them in one carte blanche or one big piece of fudge to go into the dumpster? Or when we say all, are we being challenged to re-examine ourselves and all the things we do, make a fuller accounting of that which is included in all transgressions? Is there an accounting there, or is it just a walking away? And if there's an accounting there, it fits into the spirit of the holidays, the meaning of the holidays. A further challenge, a further provocation to take account of what you've done and examine, go back and go forward. You make one mistake, you're probably going to make it again in the future.
I mean, I think I don't know that this, again, the specificity of the language is so prescriptive in that sense, as we've discussed. The mystery behind the liturgy is such that it's not a roadmap in a very specific way, but Yom Kippur itself is the roadmap, and Yom Kippur is filled with accountability. That's why there's vidui. That's why there's the slichot. That is a list, al-chait, and ashamnu, all the things that we say to actually specify the range of experience of missing the mark. And so there's both the klal and the prat. There's the general lived experience of how do we actually move from being human beings filled with all these transgressions as a collective experience, and also an accounting of the specificity, and neither is unimportant. I think we have to live in both our general existence and also the specificity of who we've uniquely been in all the choices that we've made.
I think we're going to come to the end of the session. And I just want to, I'll invite you, Felicia, to say some words at the end, but there is a beautiful sentiment that that Heschel conveys in the difference between Tisha B'Av and Yom Kippur. So Tisha B'Av is a day of heartbreak, it's a day of pain, it's a day of remember catastrophes, and so the feeling, it's a fast day, just as Yom Kippur. It's a 25-hour fast day, just as Yom Kippur. The difference between the two, Heschel reports, this is what the Hasidim say, is on Tisha B'Av, who can eat? Who can eat? We're like going through so much pain. On Yom Kippur, the difference is who wants to eat, who needs to eat. We don't need to eat. We're in a different level of, we're in a different spiritual level. We're in a high spiritual level. We are in a, as I said before, feeling so angelic at some point, when the hunger begins to be felt. So who really needs to eat? And I hope we can, grow to that place, during this day, through the rituals, through the prayers, through the music, through the presence of the community, to the place where it's like, who needs to eat? I want to stay in this glorious, awesome, wonderful place of intimacy, of prayer, and envisioning myself and ourselves in a much better place. But it begins with Kol Nidre, and and then we have to ascend to that mountain.
Begin in there. In there. So we hope everyone will have a very meaningful journey through Yamim Nora'im, and we hope you know where you're going, and to remind ourselves that that we have a journey to choose, and that's not only by showing up physically, but is to how we embody the lived experience through the journey that the tradition outlays. But we have the privilege of traveling both individually in our own intimacy with ourselves and God, but also collectively as a community, which is part of what allows us to travel. So we hope to travel with you during the course of these Yamim Nora'im. Wish you a Shana Tova U'Metuka, and we look forward to seeing many of you in person, and some of you'll see us, but we won't see you.
Shana Tova to everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank
you.
Excellent food.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That was great.
Thank you.
Shana Tova, thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.